She missed her flight, broke her heel, and got stuck in a snowstorm. He just handed her a roll of duct tape and changed both their lives forever. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The snow had started slow, like a whisper, barely noticeable at first. Just a flurry or two brushing against the shop windows, dissolving on windshields, clinging to the corners of heavy coats. But by the time the noon bell rang from the church steeple in Hollow Creek, the whisper had turned into a full-blown conversation, and no one liked what it was saying. Visibility dropped, roads disappeared beneath a white blanket thick enough to swallow headlights. And just like that, everything stopped. The bus station on Maple Street, usually half abandoned during the week, was suddenly alive with people huddled against the wind. The schedule board blinked with delays and cancellations, and somewhere in the background, an old space heater rattled like it was fighting for its last breath. Locals pulled scarves tighter, muttered about the storm, and checked their phones in unison, hoping for a miracle that wasn't coming. Among them stood a woman who didn't quite fit. Her coat was too sleek, her boots too thin, and her eyes, sharp, dark, observant, seemed to be scanning not just the crowd, but herself, as if trying to decide what she was doing there at all. Her luggage, a single rolling bag, sat beside her like it too was confused. She checked her phone again, lips pressed into a tight line, then slid it back into her pocket and exhaled. No car service, no backup, no flight, no escape. She was trying not to look irritated, but the cold had a way of stripping away all pretense. The ends of her hair were damp from melting snowflakes. Her heel had snapped the moment she'd stepped off the bus hours earlier, and now there was nowhere to go but this fluorescent-lit box of frustration and forced patience. No one seemed to recognize her, and that was just how she wanted it, because if they had, if even one person had glanced long enough to realize who she was, there would have been questions, expectations, judgments. But here in this frozen pause between two worlds, she wasn't a CEO or a headline. She was just a woman with nowhere to be and no one to impress. And that, strangely, was starting to feel like the closest thing to peace she'd known in years. Evan Brooks didn't even mean to stop. He had planned to drop off a spare tire at old Mrs. Lanning's place, grab 2 hot chocolates for the twins from Parker's Cafe, and head straight back to the shop before the storm got any worse. But something about the woman at the bus stop caught his eye, not just the way she stood there, looking completely out of place, but the way she kept shifting her weight, like she was trying not to fall apart. Her shoe gave it away, a designer heel, the kind no one in Hollow Creek would wear unless it was a wedding or they'd lost a bet, bent unnaturally at the arch. She was trying to hide it, leaning subtly against the metal bench as if casual posture could erase the problem. But Evan had fixed too many broken things in his life to miss the signs. He parked his truck along the curb, stepped out into the falling snow, and approached with the kind of calm that only came from raising kids on your own and learning how to solve problems with whatever was in arm's reach. "Need a hand?" he asked, nodding toward the damaged shoe. The woman hesitated. "I'm fine." He tilted his head. "You're standing like someone who's about 5 seconds away from a twisted ankle." She sighed, glancing down. "It snapped earlier, of course." He crouched beside her, reaching into the side pocket of his coat. "Lucky for you, I carry miracles." She raised an eyebrow. "You're a cobbler now?" "Nope, mechanic. But duct tape doesn't discriminate." He pulled out the silver roll, tore a strip with practiced ease, and carefully wrapped the heel. She watched him work, something softening in her posture. When he finished, he stood brushing the snow from his jeans. "Good as temporary new," he said, grinning. She laughed, a sound that surprised even her. "You just saved my ankle, and maybe my pride." He smiled. "Happy to be of service, ma'am." She looked at him closely then, not like a stranger anymore, but like someone wondering if maybe, just maybe, she'd stumbled across something real. The wind outside howled against the glass of the diner like a stray dog, begging to come in. Inside the small corner booth was a pocket of warmth, a chipped red vinyl seat, a fogged-up window, and a steaming mug of cocoa that Evan slid across the table toward his daughter. Grace, 7 years old, and missing her 2 front teeth, cradled the cup in her mittened hands like it was made of gold. Nora, though they still didn't know her last name, sat across from them, her repaired heel resting awkwardly to one side, her coat folded neatly in her lap. The waitress had brought a fresh pot of coffee and 2 menus, but Nora hadn't touched hers. She was watching the little girl with cautious curiosity, like she wasn't quite sure what to do with something so unfiltered. Grace unwrapped her sandwich, a peanut butter and honey concoction slightly squished from the truck ride, and took a big bite. After a moment she paused, then tilted the sandwich toward Nora. "You want some?" she asked, eyes wide and sincere. "I don't mind sharing." Evan opened his mouth to intervene, habit really, but Nora beat him to it, her hand rising gently. "That's very sweet of you, Grace, but I don't want to take your lunch." Grace shrugged. "It's okay. Daddy says kindness is better than money, and you look like you had a hard day." Nora blinked, once, twice, then let out the softest breath, one she hadn't even realized she was holding. "Your dad sounds like a smart man." Grace grinned. "He is. He fixes everything, even Mommy's music box. It doesn't play anymore, but he made it light up again." Evan looked down at his coffee. He hadn't known Grace still remembered that. Nora's gaze lingered on the two of them, no flash of recognition, no walls, just quiet awe. This wasn't charity, it wasn't pity, it was a girl who knew nothing of brands or bank accounts, offering a sandwich like it was the most natural thing in the world. And for the first time in days, Nora felt hunger, not for food, but for that kind of simple, unshakable good. They sat there for a while, letting the snow pile up against the diner's windows like nature had pressed pause on the rest of the world. Grace was now busy drawing on a paper napkin with a crayon the waitress had scrounged up from behind the counter. Her sketch, a smiling stick figure with big brown boots and a truck, was unmistakably her dad. Evan watched with a faint smile before turning his attention back to the woman across from him. She was staring into her coffee, untouched and cooling fast, fingers loosely curled around the mug as if it anchored her. She hadn't said much since Grace offered her the sandwich. Just nodded, thanked them, and gone quiet again. Evan, never one to push, finally leaned back and asked gently, "So, what's your name?" Her eyes flicked up to his. There was no panic, no shift of discomfort, just a pause, like she had to decide which version of herself to hand over. "Nora," she said after a beat. He nodded. Nora. He didn't ask for a last name. She hadn't offered one, and there was something in her tone that made him respect the line she wasn't ready to cross. Nora, simple, clean. But the way she said it, soft, steady, almost like a sigh, it carried something behind it, like she'd shed a heavier name at the edge of town and chosen this one instead, just for now. He didn't press, he didn't need to. In Hollow Creek, names mattered less than actions, and this woman, whatever story she wasn't telling, had been cold, stranded, and graceful in the face of every awkward kindness they'd offered. "Well, Nora," he said, offering her a smile as warm as the cocoa his daughter now slurped happily. "Welcome to Hollow Creek. You picked a heck of a day to visit." She let out a breath that might have been a laugh. "I didn't mean to end up here." "Most good things start that way," he replied. And though she said nothing in return, the look in her eyes said she'd felt the truth in it, maybe for the first time in a long, long while. The bell above the door chimed with that old familiar jingle as they stepped into the warmth of the Hollow Creek Cafe. The windows fogged immediately behind them, sealing them off from the wind's sharp whistle outside. It wasn't fancy, linoleum floors, mismatched chairs, a menu board with half the letters missing, but it smelled like cinnamon and fried eggs, and in that moment it felt like a cathedral. Evan rubbed his hands together and led the way to a booth near the radiator. Nora followed, her movements careful, like she wasn't quite sure if she was intruding or being invited. Grace climbed into the seat beside her dad, legs swinging freely, already eyeing the pastry case behind the counter. A tired-looking waitress shuffled over, pad in hand. "The usual, Evan?" He nodded. "And a coffee for my friend here." The woman, Nora, opened her mouth as if to protest, but Evan held up a hand. "Don't argue. It's the only thing I can afford to share today, so let me pretend I'm a generous man." That made her smile, the kind that flickered across her face like a match being struck in the dark. "All right," she said, "just coffee." When the waitress left, Nora glanced at him. His coat had seen better days. His jeans were worn at the knees, but it was his hands she kept looking at, resting now on the edge of the table, strong, cracked, calloused. The kind of hands that knew work, real work, and didn't shy away from it. "You're a mechanic?" she asked. He nodded. "Small shop. Mostly busted pickups and snowmobiles this time of year." She traced a finger around the rim of her mug. "You fix things for a living." Evan chuckled softly. "Trying to, yeah. Some things stay fixed. Others," he shrugged, "you just keep showing up." The coffee arrived, and she wrapped her hands around the mug. The warmth soaked into her fingers. But it was the quiet steadiness of the man across from her that thawed something deeper. She didn't know it yet, but she'd remember this place, not for the coffee or the heat, but for the man who gave her shelter without needing a reason. The snow hadn't let up. If anything, it was falling harder now, thick, lazy flakes that blanketed the world in white and silence. After finishing their drinks, Evan had offered to walk Nora back to the bus stop while they waited for updates. Grace skipped ahead in her oversized boots, leaving little stomping footprints along the sidewalk, humming some half-remembered tune from a Christmas special. Nora followed beside Evan, her arms tucked into her coat, hands hidden but clearly trembling. She hadn't complained once, not about the wind, the wetness, or the cold that nipped at her cheeks. But Evan noticed. He always noticed the quiet kind of discomfort, especially the kind people tried to hide. When they reached the edge of the sidewalk just outside the general store, he stopped. Reaching into his coat pocket, he pulled out a pair of brown wool gloves, worn but intact, and held them out to her without a word. Nora looked at them, then up at him. "I'm okay." "You're not," he said softly, his tone matter-of-fact, not pitying. "Take 'em. They're warm." She hesitated again, then finally took them, slowly sliding her fingers inside. They were warm, fresh from the inside of his coat. Not just warm with heat, but with something else she hadn't expected. Something human. "They're too big," she said, a bit of a smile tugging at her lips. He shrugged. "Means your hands have room to think." She laughed, the sound dry but genuine. "That's not how hands work." "Sure they do," he replied. "They remember what they've touched, what they've let go of. Sometimes they need space to figure it out." She stared at him a second longer, then looked down at her gloved hands. They looked ridiculous on her, oversized and slightly frayed, but somehow fitting. For a woman who had everything tailored, everything polished and pressed, the gloves were the first thing she'd worn in a long time that felt real. And as the wind picked up and Grace called out from the snowbank ahead, Nora pulled the gloves tighter and followed. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Back at the bus shelter, the world looked like it had been tucked under a thick white blanket. The bench was dusted in snow, and the glass panes were fogged from the inside out, blurring the figures waiting in silence. Nora brushed a spot clean and sat down, her gloved hands resting in her lap. Evan remained standing, arms crossed loosely, as he watched the empty road stretch on like a forgotten promise. Grace had curled up on the bench beside her father's coat, head nodding with the weight of warmth and sugar. Nora reached into her purse, pulling out a slim wallet, the kind made of soft leather and sleek design, stitched with care, expensive in that quiet, effortless way. She slid out a crisp bill and held it toward him. "For the coffee and the gloves," she said. Evan looked at it, then at her, and gently shook his head. "No." "Come on," she urged, not used to refusal. "It's only fair." "You don't owe me anything," he said simply. "Just stay warm." She stared at him like he'd spoken in a foreign language. It wasn't the amount. It wasn't about money at all. It was the way he'd said it, like generosity didn't come with strings or conditions, like kindness was meant to stand alone. "I'm not trying to insult you," she said quietly, holding the bill out again, softer this time. "I know," Evan replied, "but not everything's a transaction." And there it was, the line that hit her harder than she'd expected. Not everything's a transaction. She lowered her hand, tucked the bill back into her wallet. No one in her world said no to money, not unless they wanted something else. But this man, he wanted nothing. Not her name. Not a favor. Not recognition. Just for her to be warm. She looked down at the gloves. They were starting to itch, but she didn't take them off. Instead, she leaned back against the bench and looked out at the road with him, unsure of what had shifted between them. Only that something had. Something she couldn't explain, and wasn't sure she wanted to. The sky had faded to a dull steel gray, the kind that made it hard to tell where daylight ended and night began. Snow drifted in lazy swirls down the street, and the wind had settled into a steady, biting rhythm. Inside the bus shelter, the air was cold enough to make breath visible again, and Grace had fallen asleep with her head on her dad's lap, a crumpled napkin drawing still clutched in her fingers. Nora checked her phone for the 5th time in 10 minutes. The transit app now displayed a red banner. Route 6, canceled due to severe weather. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and she slid the phone back into her pocket like it had betrayed her. Evan didn't look surprised, just glanced out at the street as if waiting for the road to confirm what they both already knew. "Well," he said finally, voice low and even, "looks like you're stuck." She nodded a little too quickly. "I'll figure something out." He let the words hang there for a second, then added, "I've got a truck. It's not pretty, and it rattles when you make right turns, but it'll get you to Fairview." She hesitated, not because of him, he hadn't given her any reason not to trust him, but because she wasn't used to depending on anyone, especially not someone whose windshield wipers probably squeaked and whose backseat had crayons ground into the upholstery. Still, the idea of sitting here all night in a glass box, waiting on help that wouldn't come, was far less appealing. "I don't want to be a burden," she said. "You won't be," Evan replied. "Grace and I were heading that way anyway. Figured we'd drop off a few parts before the road's ice over." Nora looked down at her gloved hands again, his gloves, and then at the sleeping girl curled up beside him, utterly at peace. She nodded. "All right." Evan gave a small smile and stood, gently lifting Grace into his arms. As they stepped into the snow-covered street together, Nora realized this wasn't the direction she'd planned. But for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like a detour. It felt like a beginning. The road to Fairview was narrow and winding, a 2-lane stretch that dipped through frozen fields and sleepy farmland. The snow had let up slightly, but the sky remained heavy, as if holding back one final storm. Evan's truck, a battered old Chevy with mismatched doors and a heater that worked when it felt like it, rumbled steadily along the icy pavement. Grace was curled up in the back seat beneath a wool blanket, snoring softly, her head lolling against the window. Nora sat up front, her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes drifting between the snow-covered landscape and the man behind the wheel. He drove with quiet confidence, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, the other adjusting the heat vents every so often. There was something soothing about the way he moved, unhurried, unbothered, like he'd learned to make peace with life's unpredictability. They were halfway to town when the truck gave its first protest, a low, stuttering cough from the engine that made the whole frame shudder. Evan's eyebrows lifted. "Ah!" There it is. There what is? Nora asked, suddenly alert. He eased the truck onto the shoulder, letting it idle as the engine sputtered and hiccuped again. Then it died. Completely. Evan didn't curse, didn't groan, just sighed, and leaned forward, tapping the dashboard like it was an old friend with a bad habit. "She's a little cold-blooded," he said, reaching under the seat for his flashlight. "Sometimes forgets how to breathe when the wind's this sharp." Nora watched as he climbed out and popped the hood, the light of the flashlight casting a soft glow over the snowflakes still drifting down. He bent over the engine with a kind of care that surprised her, not rushed, not annoyed, like he was speaking a language only the two of them understood. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. She stayed in the truck, watching through the fogged glass, watching the way his breath curled into the cold, the way his hands moved confidently over frayed wires and frost-bitten metal. When he finally slid back behind the wheel, he gave her a sheepish grin. "Try now." The engine turned, once, twice, then roared back to life. Nora didn't say anything at first, but when she looked at him, something in her gaze had changed. It wasn't just appreciation, it was wonder, not at the fix, but at the man who never once treated it like a problem, just another thing to take care of and keep moving. By the time they reached the edge of Fairview, the roads were starting to glaze over with thin, invisible ice. Evan glanced at the clock on the dashboard, then at Grace, still asleep in the back seat, her tiny fists clutching the edge of the blanket. He let out a slow breath. "Hope you don't mind a detour," he said, turning the truck down a quiet gravel road lined with bare trees. "We're closer to my place than anywhere else right now. Safer to wait out the ice." Nora didn't argue. She simply nodded, though she wasn't sure what she was agreeing to. Her world didn't include unexpected visits to strangers' homes. It certainly didn't include unplanned evenings in houses that rattled over every bump in the road. And yet, here she was, letting go of her schedule, her image, her usual rules. It felt strange, but not wrong. When they pulled into the driveway, the headlights lit up a small two-story house with peeling paint and a crooked front step. The porch light flickered once before staying on, casting a soft yellow glow over a pair of worn boots and a snow shovel leaning against the railing. The air outside smelled of pine and faint wood smoke. Evan carried Grace inside with practiced ease, nodding for Nora to follow. She stepped into a home that wasn't large or modern, but wrapped around her like a thick, handmade quilt. The walls were lined with faded photos in mismatched frames. A hand-painted welcome sign hung crookedly near the kitchen. The air smelled of cinnamon and old coffee and something sweet baking, even though the oven was off. And scattered across the living room floor were colored pencils, dolls, and paper snowflakes cut by uncertain little hands. Nora stood there, still wearing his gloves, her breath catching somewhere between her ribs. "This is—" she started, then trailed off. "It's not much," Evan said, setting Grace gently onto a worn couch and tucking a throw over her. "But it's ours." She looked around again, the worn rugs, the lamp with the frayed cord, the wall where height marks were scribbled in pen. It was real, imperfect, loved. And for a woman who lived in pristine penthouses with polished stone floors and echoing emptiness, this was the warmest place she'd felt in years. Grace woke with a yawn and a stretch, her hair tousled and cheeks pink from sleep. She blinked once at Nora, as if making sure the woman from the snowstorm hadn't been a dream, then offered a shy little grin before hopping off the couch. Nora sat on the floor, legs tucked to the side, cradling a mug of tea Evan had quietly placed in her hands. She hadn't asked for it. He hadn't asked if she wanted it. But it was hot and steeped just right, like he somehow knew she needed it more than she realized. Grace knelt by the coffee table and began rummaging through a shoebox stuffed with crayons, stickers, and folded construction paper. "Want to see my art?" Nora looked down, caught off guard by the question. "Sure," she said with a small nod, setting the mug aside. The little girl's fingers moved quickly, pulling out sheet after sheet, crayon drawings filled with crooked stars, smiling suns, lopsided houses, a snowman with purple boots, a girl with long hair holding hands with a tall figure in blue. "That's me and Daddy," Grace explained, pointing. "And that's Mommy." Nora's gaze paused at the third figure, drawn in yellow with a crown of tiny stars. "Where's she now?" Nora asked gently. Grace looked up, completely matter-of-fact. "She lives in the stars." Nora blinked. "Oh." Grace didn't say it with sadness, just certainty, like it was the most natural place for a mother to be. "She got sick when I was little," she added softly. "But Daddy says she watches every night, like a guardian angel, but prettier." Nora's smile faltered, eyes lingering on the crayon crown. She didn't know what to say to that. She had grown up in a world where loss was whispered behind closed doors, and grief was something you buried beneath work and wealth. But here, in this modest home with fraying curtains and chipped mugs, a 7-year-old was teaching her something about grace. And for the first time in a very long time, Nora felt something loosen in her chest. Not pity, not sorrow, just awe. Dinner was a simple affair. Grilled cheese sandwiches, browned to crispy perfection, and tomato soup from a can, stirred slowly on the stovetop like it was gourmet. The table was small, its surface scratched from years of elbows and crayons, but it held everything that mattered. 2 chipped bowls, 3 glasses of water, and a warmth Nora couldn't quite define. Grace chattered between bites, telling stories about school and how her friend Ellie said boys were gross, but she didn't believe it because Daddy wasn't gross. He was funny. Evan just chuckled, nodding along, his eyes never straying far from her, making sure she ate, making sure she felt heard. Nora sat quietly at first, listening more than speaking, her spoon hovering in her bowl as she studied the rhythm of this little world. Evan didn't dominate the room, didn't command attention. He didn't need to. He was present in a way that most people forgot how to be. He asked Grace how her drawing project was going, and she launched into a passionate explanation about unicorns and glitter glue and why the stars should be pink instead of white. And he listened, not half-heartedly, not distracted, but like it mattered more than anything else in that moment. When Grace spilled a little soup, she gasped and reached for a napkin. "Sorry." "It's all right," Evan said gently, already wiping it up. "Just means you're enjoying it." Nora watched the exchange, something shifting behind her eyes. There was no sharpness in his tone, no sigh, no complaint, just calm, easy grace. Later, when Grace ran off to get her pajamas, Nora leaned back in her chair and looked across the table. "You're a really good father," she said softly. Evan smiled, a tired but genuine curve of his lips. "I'm just doing my best. Some days that means soup and crayons. Other days it's fixing nightmares with extra hugs." Nora looked down at her bowl, her throat tightening. She'd seen executives break under pressure that paled in comparison to what this man handled every single day, with no spotlight, no applause, just quiet strength. He wasn't just raising a daughter, he was holding up an entire world, with 2 hands that never asked for recognition. By nightfall, the world outside had vanished under a thick veil of white. The wind whispered through the trees like it carried old stories, and snow piled high against the windows, muting the town into a hush that made everything feel farther away. Roads were impassable, power lines crackled with ice, and the weather alert on Nora's phone confirmed what they all suspected. No one was going anywhere tonight. Grace had already fallen asleep again, this time in her own bed, wrapped in blankets and dreams. The house had settled into that quiet stretch between conversation and rest, and Nora stood near the living room window, arms crossed, watching the snowfall like it might reveal something if she stared long enough. "I can sleep on the couch," she said after a long silence. "It's really not a big deal." Evan glanced over from the hallway, a quilt folded in his arms. "Didn't think it was." She raised an eyebrow. "Then what's that for?" He walked over, draping the extra quilt along the back of the couch with care. You're wearing borrowed gloves, sitting on borrowed time, and pretending you're not freezing. I'm fine, she insisted again, almost convincing herself this time. Evan paused, looked her square in the eye, and said it gently, like someone who didn't say much unless it mattered. It's cold out there. For everyone? Nora didn't respond right away, just sat down slowly, her fingertips brushing the edge of the quilt as if it might disappear if she moved too fast. It smelled faintly of cedar and lavender, comfort sewn into every thread. "Thank you," she murmured. He just nodded, turning toward the hallway. "Holler if you need anything." The floor creaks in 3 places, the pipes hum when the heat kicks on, and the dog next door thinks he owns the county. So if you hear something strange, it's probably not ghosts. That made her smile barely. When the light clicked off and the quiet settled back in, Nora lay there in the glow of the fire's last embers, wrapped in a stranger's kindness, and a storm that had brought her farther than miles ever could. The room had gone still, wrapped in the kind of silence only heavy snow could create, thick, padded, reverent. The only sound was the slow tick of the clock above the fireplace, and the occasional groan of old wood settling under the weight of winter. Nora lay curled on the couch, the extra quilt pulled to her chin, her breath slow, her limbs beginning to thaw after days of tight-lipped posture and icy tension. Then, buzz. The vibration cut through the quiet, persistent, and familiar. Her phone lit up against the coffee table, the screen casting a sharp glow in the otherwise warm room. "Call, Allison, assistant." Nora stared at the name. It felt like another life blinking at her in white letters. Allison never called unless it was urgent. Contracts, investors, schedules. The world she'd built with manicured hands and bulletproof branding. The world where everything was controlled. Everything except the ache in her chest she hadn't been able to name for years. She didn't move to answer. The phone buzzed again. A second call. A louder vibration. A reminder that outside these walls she was still someone with a title and an empire waiting, but tonight that world felt like static. Her thumb hovered over the screen, then slid it to silence. She flipped the phone over and tucked it under a pillow, as if burying it might keep that other life from seeping in. From the hallway, a soft creak of floorboards. Evan, checking on Grace, maybe, or just moving through his home like he always had. Quiet, careful, steady. She listened to it like music, real life. The kind that doesn't beg for attention but hums under the surface, asking nothing but presence. Nora leaned back into the couch, pulled the quilt tighter, and exhaled slowly. The boardroom could wait. Tonight was made of cinnamon air and crayon drawings, of warm hands and borrowed gloves. It wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect, but it was achingly human. And for the first time in a long, long time, she didn't want to be anywhere else. The next morning melted slowly into afternoon, the storm still gripping the town in a hush, turning everything into white and wonder. With no traffic outside, no meetings on her calendar, and no place to rush off to, Nora found herself doing something she hadn't done in years. Nothing at all. Evan had tossed her a pair of sweatpants after breakfast. They were soft, faded, too big in the waist, and cinched with a string that looked like it had been tied and retied a dozen times. He hadn't said much, just, "Figured you'd want out of those city clothes." She'd hesitated at first, holding them like they might sting. But eventually, she changed. Now, Nora sat cross-legged on the living room rug, wearing borrowed sweatpants, a flannel shirt with a missing button, and 2 completely mismatched socks, one with tiny red hearts, the other with a stretched-out dinosaur. And she was laughing, not politely, not performatively, but laughing, deep, real, and unfiltered, as Grace tried to see how many pieces of popcorn she could catch in her mouth and ended up with most of them in her hair. Evan sat nearby in the old armchair, a bowl of popcorn resting on his knee. He didn't say much, just watched, with that calm presence of his, occasionally tossing a piece toward Grace or gently teasing her whenever she missed. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room, and the whole house smelled like something warm and slightly sweet, like safety. Nora felt the old tension in her shoulders begin to dissolve. The tension that came from years of always being seen, always being judged, always having to maintain the illusion that everything was under control. But here, there were no cameras, no assistants, no rehearsed charm. No one expected her to be brilliant. No one needed her to be powerful. They just let her be. And in that flannel shirt, with popcorn in her lap and a child beside her who didn't care who she was, Nora found something far rarer than applause. She found permission to be human. The house dimmed with the slow fade of dusk, the snow outside casting a soft blue glow against the windows. Everything inside moved slower now, as if the storm had calmed more than just the streets. Grace yawned wide, her eyelids drooping as she leaned against her dad's shoulder, still wrapped in the blanket she insisted was magic. Nora sat quietly on the edge of the couch, watching a world unfold she hadn't known she was starving for. Evan stood and scooped Grace into his arms without a word. She clung to his neck out of habit, not need, murmuring something about brushing her teeth tomorrow instead. He chuckled but didn't push, just carried her down the hall, soft steps that barely creaked the floor, as if his whole body had learned how to move in rhythm with the weight of fatherhood. Nora followed at a distance, not wanting to intrude but unable to look away. From the hallway she watched as he set Grace down in her small bed, the walls painted with stars and hand-drawn rainbows. He helped her into pajamas, one sleeve at a time, humming something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like a lullaby. No lectures, no hurry, just quiet care. He smoothed her blankets, tucked in the corners the way she liked, and leaned in to kiss her forehead. "Night, starshine," he whispered. Grace mumbled, half asleep. "Night, Daddy. Love you." Nora's hand gripped the doorway, not for support, but for grounding. It had been years, maybe a decade, since she'd seen tenderness like that. Not performative, not for show. Just steady, deliberate presence. The kind of love that doesn't demand attention, because it's too busy doing the work of showing up. Evan stepped into the hallway, not startled to see her there. He simply nodded as he passed and made his way back toward the living room, giving her space to follow or not. She did. And in that moment, Nora realized something that hit her harder than she expected. She hadn't been around someone who loved like that in years, and she didn't want to leave it behind. The storm broke sometime in the early hours of the morning. By sunrise, the sky had turned a pale gold, streaked with soft clouds, and the snow outside lay undisturbed, clean, quiet, perfect. Hollow Creek had awakened beneath a blanket of calm, the kind that only comes after a long night of being held still by the weather. The fire in the living room had long since gone cold, and the scent of cinnamon had faded into the wooden walls. Evan stirred in the hallway, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, expecting to hear the faint hum of cartoons or the clatter of Grace pulling cereal boxes from the shelf. Instead, he found silence and an empty couch, no quilt, no flannel shirt, no mismatched socks tossed carelessly to the side, just a folded note carefully placed on the windowsill, propped between the curtain and the glass like she wanted the light to find it before he did. He opened it with grease-worn fingers, the paper soft and weightless in his hand. "Evan, I didn't want to wake you. Honestly, I didn't trust myself to say goodbye out loud. I came here by accident and somehow walked straight into something real. Thank you for the warmth, the kindness, the space to breathe, and for showing me that not everything needs fixing to be worth holding on to. Tell Grace her drawings are better than anything hanging in my office. Nora." No last name, just like before. Evan stood there, the note still in hand, the morning sun cutting across the floorboards. He glanced out the window. Tire tracks curved gently away from the house, already half filled with fresh snow. She was gone. Not with a flourish, not with fanfare, just gone. like a snowflake melting on contact, quiet, brief, impossible to forget. He folded the letter slowly and slipped it into the drawer beneath the coffee table. She didn't owe him goodbye, but part of him hoped, deep down, behind all the steady, unshakable calm, that this wasn't the last time her name would cross the windowsill with morning light. It was 3 days later when the world caught up. Evan had just finished changing the oil on a neighbor's pickup when the television in the corner of the shop crackled to life. Grace sat at the workbench with her juice box and a coloring book, humming softly as the noon news rolled on in the background. He wiped his hands with a rag, listening without listening, until a familiar voice, smooth and composed, cut through the static. He turned. There she was, standing behind a podium in a dark navy coat, hair neatly pulled back, the city skyline behind her like a wall of steel and ambition. Nora. Not in flannel, not in borrowed socks, but in her world, poised, controlled, powerful. The banner beneath her image read, "Nora Halston, CEO of Halston Motors, announces new rural outreach initiative." The reporter's voice chimed in. In a surprising address earlier today, Halston Motors CEO Nora Halston announced a new initiative aimed at supporting small-town repair shops and community-driven trade programs. The move follows what her team is calling a deeply personal experience during last week's winter storm. Evan's hand stilled, the rag falling to the floor. On screen, Nora looked calm, polished, everything she was supposed to be, but her voice had a different weight to it now. Something real lived beneath the cadence. In a world where everything is curated, transactional, and often detached, she said, I was reminded, by a stranger, that authenticity still exists, that kindness doesn't ask for credit, that sometimes the people with the least to give offer the most. Grace looked up from her drawing. Daddy, that's her. He nodded slowly. The broadcast cut to applause, then back to the anchor, who rattled off the details of Halston's unexpected philanthropic turn, but Evan didn't hear the rest, because she had said it without saying it. Their quiet moment, sheltered in snow, in soup, and crayons, and silence, had shifted her, enough to echo into boardrooms, enough to matter. He didn't know if she'd ever come back, but now he knew who she was, and more importantly, he knew who she wasn't pretending to be. The days had begun to stretch again, like the winter's grip was finally loosening. The snow still blanketed the yard, but the sun lingered a little longer each evening, turning the icicles on Evan's porch into prisms that scattered light across the worn floorboards. He was just coming back from the shop, Grace bouncing ahead of him with her backpack slung too low and her boots caked in slush, when she stopped abruptly at the mailbox. There's something in here, she said, tugging at the door. It's thick. Evan took it from her hands. A plain white envelope. No return address, no company logo, just his name, handwritten in smooth, steady ink across the front. He opened it right there on the porch. Inside was a smaller note, folded neatly, and beneath it, 2 gleaming airline tickets, first class, embossed with the kind of detail you don't see in everyday mail. One for him, one for Grace. A direct flight to the city. He blinked. The note was short. Evan, this time, I won't leave without saying hello, or goodbye. Come see what you saved. Nora. He stood still for a moment, rereading the words as Grace peered over his arm. Are we going on an airplane? She asked, her eyes going wide. Maybe, he said slowly. She gasped. Like a real one, with snacks and tiny TVs? He smiled faintly, his mind still catching up. Yeah, looks like it. The tickets felt out of place in his calloused hands, too polished, too delicate. But the note, that felt like her. Honest. Unfolded. Not dressed up in PR or promises. He looked out across the quiet field beyond the house, the snow starting to sparkle under the setting sun. He thought of duct tape on high heels, of mismatched socks, of the letter on the windowsill, and the look she gave him when she didn't have to say anything at all. Come see what you saved. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. then looked down at Grace, who was already bouncing in anticipation. "Better pack your crayons," he said, because this wasn't just an invitation, it was a door, one she'd left open just for them. The next morning smelled like pancakes and cold feet. Evan stood at the stove flipping the batter slowly, his mind far from the sizzling pan. The envelope sat on the counter, unopened since he had placed it there the night before, like a visitor waiting to be acknowledged. It hadn't moved, but it might as well have whispered all night. Grace sat at the table, swinging her legs and doodling little airplanes on a napkin. Her backpack was packed, though she wasn't going to school. She didn't know that yet. Not officially, but she could feel it. Kids always could. Evan set a plate in front of her, the top pancake shaped slightly like a heart. She grinned, drenching it in syrup. "Are we going?" she asked through a mouthful. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he poured himself a cup of coffee, black and too strong, and leaned against the counter. The tickets rested beside his mug, still catching the light like they were made of gold. He'd read her letter again that morning, half hoping it had changed overnight. It hadn't. Evan had spent most of his life earning things the hard way, scraping by, fixing what others threw out. There was pride in that, quiet pride. And the thought of stepping into her world, private jets, boardrooms, cameras, strangers in polished shoes, felt like showing up underdressed to a life he never asked to be part of. He didn't like owing anyone, not money, not favors, not feelings. But then Grace looked up at him with maple syrup on her chin and stars in her eyes. "Let's go, Daddy. Maybe they have elevators with buttons we've never even seen." He chuckled, shaking his head. "That's not the reason to go." She shrugged. "You said we should always go where people make us feel big inside, not small." That stopped him cold. He looked at her, really looked, and saw the truth in her words. Nora hadn't made him feel small, not once. He exhaled, reached for the envelope, and finally said, "All right, let's go see what waits behind that door." Grace squealed, and somewhere in the snow-covered distance, the world tilted just enough to begin again. The city hit different. Evan had never seen so much glass in one place, reflections stacked on reflections, buildings so tall they seemed to swallow the sky. Horns honked like arguments, people moved like currents, and everything gleamed like it had something to prove. Grace clung to his hand, her eyes stretched wide, her mouth hanging open in awe. Every few steps she'd stop just to spin around, neck craning up at the buildings that disappeared into the clouds. The airport had been overwhelming enough. First-class seats with warm towels and menus. Someone had called him Mr. Brooks like he owned a yacht. Grace had giggled the whole flight, narrating everything from the folding tray to the clouds. Evan had barely touched his coffee. Now they stood in front of a black SUV, its doors opening like magic, as a driver with a quiet smile ushered them inside. No one asked questions. Everything had been arranged, perfectly. He hated how efficient it all felt. It made him miss creaky floors and slow mornings. But then, just as the SUV pulled up to a tall, steel-wrapped headquarters, Halston in silver letters carved across the entry, he saw her. Nora, no heels, no suit, no army of assistants flanking her. Just jeans, sneakers, and a soft gray sweater that clung gently to her frame. Her hair was down, loose in the breeze, and when she saw them step out, her whole face softened like a light turning on behind her eyes. Grace was the first to run. "Nora!" Nora bent to catch her, laughing as Grace threw her arms around her waist without hesitation. "You made it," she whispered into Grace's hair. Evan followed, slower, still taking it all in, the gleaming lobby behind her, the cameras that thankfully hadn't found them, the polished world she belonged to. But when she turned to him, her hands still full of Grace, her smile was small and real. "Hey, Evan." "Hey," he said, the stiffness in his voice easing just a little. And in that moment, in the shadow of towers and the hum of everything too fast, she looked nothing like a billionaire. She looked like someone trying to come home, They didn't go to a rooftop restaurant or some chef's table with 9 courses and unpronounceable ingredients. Nora could have taken them anywhere. Her name opened every reservation book in the city. But instead she took them to a small bistro tucked between a bookstore and a florist, where the lights were warm, the menu handwritten, and the server called her Miss Nora, like she was just another regular. Grace climbed into the booth beside her dad, already eyeing the dessert tray 2 tables away. Evan settled in across from Nora, still half expecting a waiter to appear with pressed linen and sparkling water he didn't ask for. But none of that came. Just a friendly smile and a simple question. Soup or salad to start? Nora ordered grilled cheese and tomato bisque. Grace gasped. You eat grilled cheese too? I used to live on it, Nora said with a grin, especially when I was hiding in the back room of the office, trying not to scream at spreadsheets. Evan raised an eyebrow. That sounds familiar, except mine came from a vending machine. Their laughter was soft, unforced, the kind that belonged in places where no one had anything to prove. There were no reporters, no handlers, no flashbulbs, just chipped plates, the scent of basil and melted butter, and Nora, sitting across from him like someone who hadn't breathed easy in years. She asked about the garage, about Grace's drawings, about how many times Evan had fixed the same truck for the same neighbor. He answered slowly but not guarded. Her questions didn't feel like research. They felt like curiosity, like hunger. And somewhere between the second glass of tea and Grace smearing chocolate mousse across her cheek, Nora looked at Evan with a quiet intensity. You know, she said, I've had a lot of dinners with important people, ones with agendas and million-dollar smiles, but I don't think I've ever sat at a table and felt this full. Evan didn't reply right away. He just looked at her, the way her shoulders had dropped, the way her laugh came easier now, because this wasn't a date. And yet, it was the most honest connection she'd had in years. The Halston Motors headquarters was sleek, silent, and almost too polished to feel real. The kind of place where people walked quickly, spoke quietly, and carried tablets instead of coffee mugs. Evan had never seen so much glass, walls made of it, desks framed by it, people hidden behind it. He kept his hands in his jacket pockets, feeling like a smudge on a showroom window. Grace, on the other hand, didn't care one bit. She marched right through the lobby, holding a crumpled drawing in both hands, beaming like she owned the place. While Nora led them upstairs, past security and curious stares, Grace whispered to Evan, I'm going to give her a gift. What kind of gift? You'll see. The elevator opened into Nora's office. High ceilings, wide windows, a desk that looked like it cost more than Evan's entire house. But behind it stood Nora, no longer the woman caught in a snowstorm or the girl in mismatched socks. She was something in between now, still soft but steady. Grace walked straight to her and held up the paper. This is for your wall. Nora knelt to take it. A bright drawing of 3 stick figures standing under a giant sun. One wore jeans. One had pigtails. The last wore a crown made of stars and held the other's hands. This is you, Grace said, and me and Daddy, but not the regular you, the you with a heart. Nora blinked fast. That's beautiful, Grace, thank you. She didn't tuck it away or smile politely. She walked to the glass wall behind her desk, took down a framed certificate, and taped Grace's picture right in its place. Just like that. Later that day, during a meeting with her top executives, someone paused mid-report, eyes drifting to the wall. What's that? They asked. Nora didn't look away from her notes. Something that matters more than this slide. The room went quiet, and in that moment, more than any speech or strategy session, the culture began to shift, not because of new policies, but because a child had drawn a version of Nora no one in that boardroom had ever seen, and she chose to become it. The town hall was Nora's idea, an open-floor meeting for employees, press-free, no scripts, no slideshow decks, just people talking, honest, raw, unfiltered. The auditorium buzzed with low murmurs as workers filled the seats. Factory floor hands, designers, middle managers, even a few suits from the upper levels who rarely came down from their floors. Nora stood at the front, sleeves rolled to her elbows, a microphone in hand, and nothing rehearsed. She introduced Evan simply. "This is Evan Brooks. He's a mechanic, and a good one. But more than that, he's the kind of person I want this company to remember how to serve." He didn't want the mic. He told her that 3 times. But when she looked at him, standing there like the offer wasn't a trap but a door, he took it. The room quieted. He stepped forward, adjusting the mic like it might shock him. His hands were still stained with grease from the garage back home. "I'm not a public speaker," he said plainly, "so I'll keep it short." He glanced around. People waited. Phones didn't come out. No one dared interrupt. "I run a small shop in a small town. We don't have performance reviews. We don't do mission statements. We just fix things because they matter to someone, not because it's profitable, because it's needed." A few people nodded. Others leaned in. "You want loyalty?" he asked. "Try showing up when nobody else does. Try telling your people you see them, not their output, them." Silence fell. He looked toward Nora, then back to the crowd. "You want a legacy? It's not the building, it's the fingerprints on the bolts, the extra hour someone stays to make sure a car doesn't stall with a family inside." He handed the mic back, without flourish, without waiting for applause. But the room didn't move, because Evan Brooks hadn't come to impress them. He'd come to remind them. And in that stillness, every executive and every factory worker remembered what it felt like to believe in something real. The sun was beginning to set behind the skyline, bleeding gold through the tall windows of Nora's office. The city hummed below. Horns, footsteps, 1,000 stories unfolding in the streets. Evan sat across from her, sipping coffee from a mug that probably cost more than his truck's last repair bill. Grace was downstairs with Nora's assistant, building a cardboard rocket ship from spare office supplies and insisting she'd be home by Mars. Nora leaned forward, elbows on the desk, a quiet smile tugging at her lips. "I have something for you." He raised an eyebrow. "Unless it's a thermos of chili and a spark plug, you might be aiming high." She laughed softly, then slid a folder across the desk. "That's a formal offer. Director of Rural Strategy. You'd help us bridge the gap between small-town garages and big city resources, real hands-on work, and the salary." He opened the folder, blinked, then let out a low whistle. "Is too much," he said. She shrugged. "It's what you're worth." He closed the folder gently, not insulted, just thoughtful. "And a house," she added, "in the city if you want, or in Fairview, fully paid. Keys are yours if you say yes." Evan leaned back in the chair. The offer was everything most people dreamed about. Stability, security, recognition. It was generous, maybe too generous. But he looked past her, to the window, to the sun setting over the buildings that touched the clouds, and then looked back at her. "Thank you," he said, voice warm. "But I already have everything I need?" She blinked. "Evan? I've got Grace. A roof that squeaks, a shop full of busted bolts and stories, and a community that trusts me to keep their wheels turning. That matters to me." Nora was quiet for a long beat, then nodded, slowly, respectfully. "You're turning down a future most people would kill for." He smiled. "I'm not turning down a future, I'm choosing mine." And in that moment she understood. He wasn't poor. He was rich in a currency most people forgot existed, and she had just remembered how valuable that kind of wealth could be. The road home felt different. Not because the weather had changed or the distance had shrunk, but because something in Evan had shifted, quietly, irrevocably. He drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting near Grace's booster seat, where she was already snoring with her mouth open, crayon smudges on her fingers. The skyline of the city had disappeared hours ago, swallowed by farmland and pine trees and the familiar hum of small-town life. But when he pulled into Hollow Creek, something caught him off guard. It wasn't the warm welcome, That part he expected. Mrs. Lanning waving from her porch, Jonah tipping his cap by the feed store. It wasn't the sky stretched wide and clear or the birdsong that always sounded like home. It was his garage. He parked slowly, squinting at the structure he'd known like the back of his hand. Except now, it wasn't the same. The roof, once patched with tarps and prayer, was brand new. The siding had been painted, the windows replaced. The cracked sign above the door gleamed with fresh varnish, and beneath it, something else. A small bronze plaque, simple and quiet. It read, "For the man who repairs more than engines." He stepped out of the truck, barely noticing that Grace had woken, and followed him, barefoot, across the gravel. "Daddy," she whispered, "did you do this?" He shook his head slowly. "No, this wasn't me." He walked forward, touched the plaque gently, then turned as headlights pulled up behind him. A delivery van, no branding, just a driver with a clipboard and a polite smile. "You Mr. Evan Brooks?" Evan nodded. "Just finishing up the last of the upgrades. Work order said to have it done before you returned. All paid. No name left behind." The driver tipped his cap and left. Evan stood there for a long moment, the evening breeze brushing past his shoulders, his shop shining behind him like it had been waiting its whole life to feel worthy. He didn't need the signature, he already knew whose hand had done this. And just like that, the city hadn't taken anything from him. It had quietly given something back. Spring came late to Hollow Creek that year, but when it finally arrived, it did so with purpose. The snow melted in sheets, revealing wildflowers daring enough to bloom early, and the air carried the scent of damp soil and promises. Evan was back in rhythm, wrench in hand, grease under his nails. Grace's laughter echoing from somewhere in the yard as she chased fireflies too early for the season. Then came the invitation. A folded note, hand-delivered by the mayor himself, a dedication ceremony, a surprise, no details. Evan had half a mind to skip it, too wary of being made into some small-town poster boy. But Grace tugged at his hand wearing a dress she picked out herself and said, "Come on, Daddy. I think it's about something good." She was right. The whole town gathered just off Main Street, where an empty lot had sat neglected for years. Once a condemned schoolhouse, now something else entirely. A modest building stood in its place, freshly painted, framed by budding trees and the beginnings of a garden. Children's voices spilled from inside, mingling with music and the hum of curious townsfolk. There were no speeches, no podiums, just a covered sign nailed to the front of the building. Nora stood beside it, smiling. Not in a gown, not in heels, just jeans, boots, and the same soft sweater she wore that first night in the city. She looked at Evan, then at Grace, and without a word, pulled the cover off the sign. The crowd hushed. Grace Place, where kindness grows. Evan didn't speak, couldn't. His throat caught and his chest swelled with something so big it barely fit. Grace blinked at the sign, then gasped. "That's my name?" Nora knelt beside her. "It is, because your kindness planted something in me, and now it gets to grow in others." The mayor clapped first, then the town followed. But Evan didn't hear any of it. He only saw the girl beside him, beaming in front of a place that would outlive them all. A building without glass towers or stock tickers. Just soil, seeds, and a name that meant something far greater than fortune. The summer air in Hollow Creek was thick with crickets and the scent of honeysuckle, the kind of night where even the wind felt too lazy to move. Evan sat on the porch swing, a cold lemonade in one hand, the other resting on the armrest Grace had covered in glitter glue a week ago. The stars were beginning to blink awake, scattered across the sky like breadcrumbs, leading somewhere you couldn't quite see. Grace had already gone to bed, her laughter still echoing faintly in his ears from their earlier backyard game of flashlight tag. The town was quiet, the kind of quiet that lets thoughts breathe. Then he saw headlights crest the hill. Not bright, not urgent, just steady. They pulled into his driveway slow, like they were asking permission. He stood, not alarmed, but curious. The truck door creaked open and out stepped Nora. No entourage, no designer heels, no one else, just her. In a denim jacket and soft black jeans, hair pulled back in a simple knot, like she'd packed light and driven far. She looked different, not unrecognizable, but settled, like something had finally clicked back into place inside her. She stood at the edge of his porch, silhouetted by the porch light, her hands loosely at her sides. "I didn't call," she said. "I noticed. I didn't want it to be scheduled," she added, "or expected. I just wanted to come back the way I left. Quiet." Evan nodded, saying nothing yet, just waiting, the way he always did, without pressure, without performance. She stepped up onto the porch, her voice softer now. "I'm not here for business or charity. I'm not here to give you anything." "I didn't think you were." She looked at him, finally, really looked. "I just wanted to see if maybe I could stay a while?" He didn't smile, not right away, just opened the screen door and stepped aside. "Only if you don't mind a squeaky swing and a late summer breeze," he said, and that was enough. Because she stepped through, not as a CEO, not as a guest, but as someone who had finally found her way home. The crickets had taken over the night shift, their steady chorus humming beneath the creak of the porch swing. The stars were bright now, scattered across the ink-black sky, and the moon cast a quiet glow over the yard, bathing everything in silver. Evan and Nora sat side by side, legs barely brushing, a worn quilt draped across both of their laps like it belonged there. No need for conversation, just the kind of silence that didn't ask to be filled. It had been 3 nights since she showed up again. 3 quiet mornings, 3 unhurried dinners. 3 times he'd almost asked the question that had lingered since the city, since the letter, since the first time she'd slipped away without saying goodbye. But now, under the hush of stars, he finally did. "Why me?" She turned slightly toward him, brow softening. He kept his eyes forward like the sky would make it easier to hear the answer. "You could have thanked anyone, could have picked any small-town mechanic, could have told your story 1,000 different ways, but you didn't. You picked me." There was no hesitation in her voice, no pause to choose the right words, just truth, worn smooth by time. "Because you made me feel human again." He looked at her now, surprised by how easily it came out. "I'd forgotten what that was," she continued, voice low. "I was always on, always performing, always perfect or polished or planned. And then I broke a heel in a snowstorm, and a man with duct tape and the warmest silence I've ever known just helped me. No ask, no angle, no need to impress." Evan swallowed hard. "You didn't flinch when I was a mess," she said. "You didn't try to fix me. You just let me exist." He let out a quiet breath, something heavy and gentle at once. "You ever think about how strange it all was?" he asked. "All the things that had to go wrong for us to meet?" She smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Or maybe it was everything finally going right. And under that vast, quiet sky, he reached for her hand. Not as a thank you, but as a beginning. The first snow of the season came softly, without warning, just a hush in the air, then flakes drifting down like feathers shaken loose from some unseen sky. Hollow Creek held its breath, the quiet settling into every fence post and rooftop, dusting the world in calm. Evan stepped outside to check the mailbox, a habit more than a necessity. Grace had already gone to bed, her latest masterpiece taped proudly to the fridge, and the house behind him glowed warm through the front windows. Nora followed, barefoot in the doorway, wearing one of his flannel shirts over her own clothes, sleeves rolled up and her hair loose around her shoulders. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed, eyes on him like the snow was just background noise to the real thing. He pulled an envelope from the box. Just a local newsletter, nothing important. But as he turned, the porch light caught the snow in her hair, the gentle sway of her body, the way she didn't look away when their eyes met. There was no script, No build-up, no music swelling in the distance, just her, just him. He took a step closer, the newsletter forgotten in his hand. "You cold?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "No." Another step. The snow crunched beneath his boots. She didn't move, didn't flinch, just waited. And when he reached her, there were no words, no promises, just the pause, the breath before something sacred, and then the kiss, soft, steady, real. No firework fanfare, no sweeping movie moment, just two people in flannel and snowfall, standing by a crooked mailbox on a quiet street, finally letting the silence say what neither had needed to rush. When they pulled back, she didn't say anything, just rested her forehead against his chest, breathing him in. And he wrapped his arms around her, like the answer had always been this simple. Snow kept falling, and nothing else needed to be said. By the time the daffodils pushed through the last patches of snow and the robins returned to the fence posts, the town already knew, long before Evan admitted it, long before Nora found the words. Hollow Creek had always been the kind of place where news traveled faster than cars, especially the kind wrapped in a soft glance or a smile that lingered a little longer than necessary. They didn't hold hands in public, not at first. They didn't announce anything, didn't make grand entrances or stage declarations. But people noticed. They noticed the way Evan's porch light stayed on a little later, the way Nora, who still drove back to the city once a week, always came home before dark, the way Grace had taken to drawing 4 people now, not 3, her stick-figure family growing quietly in crayon and color. At the diner, Mrs. Lanning winked when Nora ordered her coffee the way Evan did, black with a touch of cinnamon. Jonah from the hardware store started setting aside extra supplies near the register without being asked. "Just in case she gets ideas," he'd say, nodding toward the garage Nora sometimes wandered into, curious about how things were fixed without algorithms. No one treated her like a billionaire. They treated her like she belonged. And in time she did. She started sitting in on community meetings, not to speak, but to listen. She helped organize the town fair's raffle, donated anonymously to the local school, but took the stalls, and picked up trash after the picnic like it was the most natural thing in the world. She still wore boots too nice for dirt roads, still carried a phone that buzzed more than it should. But when she looked at Evan, the noise seemed to fade. People whispered, of course. "She'll leave," some said. "She won't," others replied. "Not now." Because love in Hollow Creek didn't come with headlines. It came with quiet porch swings, shared tools, and the kind of silences that felt full. And though Evan and Nora hadn't spoken the words yet, hadn't named what they were, the town already had. They were home, together, even if it had taken them longer than everyone else to see it. Years later, the world knew her name, not just from billboards or business magazines, but from the way she changed things. Factories reopened in towns that had been left behind. Scholarships bore no family crest. Community centers bloomed in places the world forgot to map. She was still CEO, still powerful. But now she was something else too, anchored. During an anniversary event in New York, surrounded by journalists, cameras, and curated flowers, a reporter leaned in with the kind of question designed to draw headlines. "What changed for you, Nora? What made you shift from corporate empire building to small-town impact?" She could have talked strategy, market trends, a personal awakening in the face of economic disparity, the kinds of things that fit neatly into interviews. But she didn't. She smiled, slow and full. It was a man with duct tape and 2 sandwiches. The room paused. A few chuckled, waiting for the real answer. But she didn't explain further, because how could she tell them that everything began in a snowstorm at a bus stop, when she was cold, lost, and cracked in places no one else could see? That a man who fixed engines had unknowingly repaired something far deeper inside her? That his daughter had offered her half a sandwich like it was the most natural thing in the world and made her believe in goodness again? She didn't need to name him, She didn't have to mention Hollow Creek or the porch swing or the plaque outside Grace Place. That story belonged to her now, tucked in with the scent of cinnamon and the hum of a garage where hearts were healed, one bolt at a time. Later that night, she returned home, to a town with one blinking stoplight, to a house with drawings still taped to the fridge, to a man who once fixed her heel with duct tape and never asked for anything in return. She kicked off her boots, stepped onto the porch, and found him there, reading, waiting, and she thought to herself, not for the first time, "This is what real feels like."